March 3, 1943. Dawn bled across the skies of Port Moresby, New Guinea, pale gold light glinting off a restless sea. Inside a B-25 Mitchell bomber, Major Edward Larner tightened his harness, eyes fixed on the instruments that vibrated with the roar of twin Wright Cyclone engines. He could taste the salt in the air and the tension in his throat. Behind him, 11 more bombers followed, silhouettes of determination slicing through humid morning haze. Their mission: to strike a Japanese convoy moving north across the Bismarck Sea. 12 transport ships guarded by 8 destroyers. Thousands of enemy troops, the kind of fleet that could alter the war's course if left untouched. But Larner was about to change naval warfare forever. 200 feet. That was the forbidden altitude, the line between innovation and suicide. Every military manual said bombers shouldn't fly that low. Anti-aircraft fire would shred them apart. But Larner wasn't listening to manuals. He was listening to the hum of his engines, the pulse in his veins, and the belief that impossible was just another word for untested. He leaned forward, speaking calmly into his headset. "Gentlemen, today we teach the world how to fight a new kind of war." The squadron's formation descended, skimming so close to the water that ocean spray kissed the bombers' bellies. The engines howled. Beasts unleashed. Each pilot watched the horizon, where black smudges of smoke marked their prey. 2 months earlier, this madness had been born in the cramped offices of Lieutenant General George Kenney, the man who refused to lose. He had watched American bombers waste ton after ton of explosives from high altitude, their bombs falling like rain that never hit its target. Out of hundreds of sorties, only a handful of ships had been sunk. Kenney needed a miracle. He found it in the mind of a maverick, Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Gunn wasn't just an engineer. He was a man possessed. His family had been trapped when Japan invaded the Philippines, and his hatred burned into invention. He took the standard B-25 Mitchell and turned it into something unrecognizable, a monster of the skies. He stripped away the bomber's glass nose and replaced it with a wall of machine guns. 4 in front, then 6, eventually 12 heavy .50 caliber guns that spat thunder straight ahead. It wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a flying gunship. When Larner first saw the modified Mitchell, his reaction was simple. "If we fly this thing low enough," he said, "we won't need luck." Kenney smiled. Then train them not to miss. Training began on the rusted skeleton of the SS Pruth, a British freighter that had run aground years earlier off Port Moresby. Day after day, Larner's men dove toward that wreck, learning to drop bombs so low that they skipped across the waves like flat stones. One mistake meant death. They called it skip bombing. At 200 feet and 200 miles per hour, the pilot had only seconds to release the bomb. Too high and it would miss. Too low, and the explosion would vaporize the plane. Every crewman understood the risk. Every man still climbed into his seat. When one aircraft struck the mast of the wreck and plunged into the sea, killing everyone aboard, Larner ordered the squadron to attend the funeral. The next morning they trained again. War doesn't reward hesitation. By late February 1943, reconnaissance reports painted a clear picture. A massive Japanese convoy was steaming from Rabaul toward Lae, New Guinea. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers and tons of ammunition. Their objective: to reinforce the Japanese garrisons fighting Australian and American troops in New Guinea's jungles. If those reinforcements landed, New Guinea could fall. And Australia could be next. Larner's squadron, the 90th Bombardment Squadron, would stop them. At 5th Air Force headquarters, maps covered the walls. Lines, coordinates, weather charts, all converging on a single stretch of ocean now destined to become a graveyard. General Kenny's plan was surgical. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses would strike first from altitude, forcing the Japanese convoy to scatter. Then the real killers, Lana's low-altitude B-25s, would sweep in at wave-top level, using their machine guns to rake the decks before releasing their bombs in perfect synchronized chaos. No one had ever tried it on this scale, and no one expected everyone to return. March 3rd dawned clear. The convoy was sighted 50 miles southeast of Finschhafen, 12 grey shapes slicing through turquoise water. Destroyers zigzagged, their guns scanning the sky. Above them, Japanese Zero fighters orbited like hornets ready to strike. Lana adjusted his goggles and exhaled. This was it. He pushed the throttles forward. Let's make history, boys. The roar of engines became a single, monstrous heartbeat. The first wave of Australian Beaufighters dived in, their cannons hammering the convoy's edges. Smoke and flame burst from a destroyer's deck. Machine gun tracers streaked through the air like fiery comets. Then came Lana's squadron. At 200 feet, the sea blurred into a streak of blue and white. Bullets whizzed past. Tracer lines crossed the cockpit windows. But Lana held steady, eyes fixed on a single Japanese transport ship that loomed larger by the second. Guns hot, his co-pilot yelled. Lana pressed the trigger. The nose guns roared to life, spitting streams of lead that tore across the enemy's deck, shredding gun crews before they could fire. Then, with one sharp pull, Lana released 2 bombs, sleek cylinders tumbling just above the surface before skipping once, twice, and slamming into the transport's hull. A flash. A bloom of orange fire. Then the ship erupted, breaking in 2. Lana's laughter was brief, cut short by the scream of flak tearing through his right wing. The aircraft jolted, alarms blaring. "We're hit!" Someone shouted. "Hold it together," Lana barked. "We're not done yet." The squadron broke into attack formations, weaving through explosions and tracer fire, each crew executing the deadly dance they had practiced for months. Ships burned. Water boiled with debris. The Japanese formation disintegrated as panic spread through their ranks. The forbidden tactic had worked. By the end of that day, 12 Japanese ships lay shattered and sinking beneath the waves. Thousands of enemy troops perished. The Bismarck Sea turned red, and in the smoldering silence that followed, a new chapter of aerial warfare was written, one that began at 200 feet above the water, with men who refused to obey the limits of fear. The ocean burned. By mid-morning, the Bismarck Sea was no longer blue. It was a boiling mix of fire, smoke, and twisted steel. Japanese ships lay crippled, listing heavily, their decks awash with flame and screaming men. The air reeked of oil and salt and gunpowder. Major Edward Lana's bomber shot through columns of black smoke, engines howling like beasts escaping hell. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage. His co-pilot's face was streaked with sweat and soot. "We hit 2 transports," he yelled over the roar. Lana just nodded. "Then we're not done." The radio crackled. Voices of other pilots filled the channel. "Ship's going down. Enemy destroyer turning port. Watch that, flak, 9 o'clock. Each transmission was a heartbeat in the chaos. The sky had become a cage of smoke trails and tracer fire. At 200 feet, every second stretched into eternity. Lana's squadron looped around for another run. They could see Japanese sailors diving into the sea, some clinging to debris, others swimming through burning fuel slicks. The smell of death filled the air. Below, the convoy was disintegrating. The destroyers tried to form a screen, guns blazing furiously. Streams of red tracers arched upward, cutting across the sky like angry scars. A Beaufighter ahead exploded mid-air, a fireball tumbling into the sea. No parachutes. Lana gritted his teeth. Stay low. Stay on target. The Mitchells came in again, their forward guns hammering. The thunder of 50 calibers drowned out everything. The sea erupted in fountains of spray and shrapnel. From the Japanese bridge of the Arashio, chaos reigned. The captain shouted orders through smoke and screams. His ship was listing badly, engines hit. Crewmen fought to keep the fire from spreading to the ammunition hold. Above, the silhouettes of American bombers swooped like vultures. Impossible. They fly so low, one officer gasped. The captain clenched his fist. They are not human. Moments later, a B-25 screamed over the deck, its guns tearing through the bridge. The captain never finished his sentence. By noon, the sky over the Bismarck Sea looked like the end of the world. Columns of black smoke rose miles high, twisting into the clouds. Bombers passed over burning wrecks, the heat from the infernos buffeting their wings. In the command tent back at Port Moresby, Lieutenant General Kenny stood silent, listening to the radio reports. His intelligence officer read out the incoming message. Target area engulfed. 12 ships confirmed sunk or burning. Estimated 6,000 enemy troops lost. Kenny exhaled slowly. God help them. But he knew this victory would echo across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy was stunned. The convoy had been annihilated, despite heavy escorts and fighter cover. The tactic, skip bombing, had turned out to be a weapon of precision and terror. Within hours, Tokyo received the news. The Imperial High Command refused to believe it at first. They demanded reports, photographic evidence. When the pictures arrived, twisted wrecks and oil fires stretching across the sea, disbelief turned to rage. How could a handful of American bombers destroy an entire convoy? Meanwhile, Lana's crew limped home. Their right engine was smoking, the tail riddled with holes. The radio operator patched up a wounded gunner while Lana coaxed the bomber across the last few miles of ocean. The men sat in silence, adrenaline fading, exhaustion sinking in. As they crossed the coastline, the ground crews below cheered. Flak-scarred aircraft landed one by one, battered but alive. Mechanics ran forward, counting bullet holes, patching fuel leaks, helping bloodied airmen out of their seats. Lana climbed down from the cockpit and looked back at his plane. The nose was scorched, the insignia nearly blackened from smoke. "You did good." "Old girl," he whispered, patting the fuselage. That night, under the flickering glow of oil lamps, the surviving crews gathered in silence. They raised their tin cups, not in celebration, but in respect for the ones who didn't come back. For those men, heroism wasn't a word. It was the sound of an engine that didn't fail, a bomb that hit true, and the memory of friends who vanished into the smoke. By the next morning, reconnaissance planes flew over the Bismarck Sea again. What they saw below defied description. Oil slicks stretched for miles, dotted with floating debris. Wooden crates, lifeboats, bodies, all drifting in slow, solemn procession. The sun reflected off the water, turning the destruction into something almost surreal. The war photographers captured it, blackened hulls still smoldering. The once mighty Japanese convoy reduced to floating tombs. The Bismarck Sea had become a graveyard. Back at Allied headquarters, Kenny drafted his report to Washington. The enemy's attempt to reinforce New Guinea has been completely destroyed. The success was due to the employment of low-altitude bombing and modified B-25 aircraft. The technique should be adopted immediately across all Pacific commands. The cable reached General Douglas MacArthur within hours. He read it twice, then smiled. "This," he said, "is how we'll take back the Pacific." The battle's results were more than tactical, they were psychological. The Japanese Navy, once confident in its convoy system, now feared the skies. The Allies had found a way to dominate the sea without ships. In the following weeks, American engineers began modifying every available bomber with forward-firing guns. Lana's squadron became the model for the new age of aerial assault, fast, low, and deadly. But for Lana, the victory was bittersweet. He walked among the hangars that evening, watching mechanics clean the soot from the B-25s. For every plane that returned, there were others still missing. Somewhere out there, the ocean held their stories. He looked toward the western horizon, where the sun was sinking into the sea. For a moment, the reflection on the water looked like fire. He whispered to himself, "War changes men, but sometimes men change war." The morning of March 3rd, 1943, began with a sky painted in hues of steel and fire. The Pacific shimmered like molten glass under the rising sun. Below the Japanese convoy, 8 transports escorted by destroyers pushed through the Bismarck Sea, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers and vital supplies bound for Lae, New Guinea. They were confident, shielded by heavy anti-aircraft guns, and a belief that Allied bombers would never dare strike from low altitude. But Major Edward Lana and his men were about to prove them wrong. Lana's B-25, squadron flying out of Port Moresby, approached the enemy formation at barely 200 feet above the ocean, so low that the waves seemed to lick the belly of the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the roar of the engines mixed with the pounding heartbeat of every man aboard. The bombers had been transformed by Paul Pappy gun, bristling with 12 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, turning each plane into a flying fortress of firepower. As the Japanese convoy came into view, Lana's voice crackled over the radio. "All right, boys, keep it tight. Let's show them how Americans fight." The formation broke into 2 waves. The first wave, led by Lana, swept in from the north, while the second came from the south, boxing in the convoy like wolves closing on wounded prey. Japanese gunners opened fire, filling the air with black bursts of flak. The sea exploded around the planes as shells struck the water. But the B-25s did not climb. They dove even lower. Lana's bomber raced toward a transport ship, the Teiyo Maru. He released his bombs just before impact, the explosives skipping across the water like flat stones, 1, 2, 3 bounces, and then slamming into the ship's hull. A blinding fireball erupted, lifting the transport from the sea in a thunderous explosion. The crew erupted in cheers, but Lana stayed focused. "Stay with it. Target the next one." All around, chaos consumed the convoy. Some bombers strafed the decks with their machine guns, cutting through Japanese troops scrambling to return fire. Others perfected the skip bombing pattern, dropping low, releasing, pulling up at the last second. Each bomb tore through steel and fire. Within minutes, ships were burning, rolling, sinking. In the distance, one B-25 took a direct hit and plunged into the ocean. The men watched it vanish beneath the waves, a chilling reminder that courage had its price. Yet no one wavered. By midday, 5 transports and 3 destroyers had been sunk. The sea was littered with oil bodies and debris. Smoke curled into the heavens as Lana's squadron regrouped. The men were exhausted, but the victory had only just begun. Over the next 2 days, March 4th of 5, the relentless attacks continued, with Australian bow fighters joining the assault. The Japanese convoy was annihilated, 12 ships destroyed, thousands of troops lost. When the final raid ended, the Bismarck Sea had turned black with oil and blood. What was once a Japanese supply lifeline was now a floating graveyard. Lana circled above the devastation, silent. His co-pilot whispered, "Sir, we did it." Lana didn't answer. He just stared at the wreckage below, half proud, half haunted. This wasn't just a victory. It was a new chapter in aerial warfare. Skip bombing had proven itself not as a gamble, but as genius. And Major Edward Lana, had become the man who changed the rules of the sky. When the smoke finally cleared over the Bismarck Sea, silence fell. A heavy, unnatural silence broken only by the crackle of burning ships and the hiss of steam rising from the shattered waters. What had once been a proud Japanese convoy was now a floating cemetery. Out of 8 transports and 8 destroyers, none escaped destruction. The waves themselves seemed to mourn, stained black with oil and blood. For Major Edward Larner and his men, the victory was not celebrated with cheers or medals that day. They returned to Port Moresby exhausted, their faces darkened by soot and sun, their uniforms soaked in sweat and salt. The ground crews met them with awe and disbelief. No one had thought such a mission was survivable, let alone successful. Larner climbed down from his aircraft, the B-25's skin pocked with bullet holes. He looked around at his crew, alive but changed. The adrenaline that had carried them through the firestorm now gave way to silence. Someone broke it with a quiet murmur. "Sir, we made history out there." Larner didn't smile, he simply nodded. "No, we just did our job." Yet deep down he knew it was more than that. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, fought from March 2nd to March 5th, 1943, would become one of the most decisive aerial victories of World War II. The Japanese army had lost over 3,000 troops, and the supply route to Leh, the gateway to New Guinea, was severed forever. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again attempt to reinforce New Guinea by sea. The secret weapon of that victory was not just courage, it was innovation. The skip bombing technique that Larner and Paul Papy-Gunn had perfected turned the B-25 from a medium bomber into a lethal ship killer. Gunn's modifications, adding up to 12 forward-firing machine guns, side-mounted cannons, and extra armor, transformed the bomber into a low-altitude gunship capable of devastating precision attacks. In later interviews, Allied commanders called the battle a textbook example of tactical adaptation. What traditional doctrine dismissed as madness, flying at 200 feet over open sea, had rewritten the rules of air warfare. But for the men who lived it, the memory was bitter-sweet. Pilots who returned from the mission spoke of seeing faces on the decks of the enemy ships, of firing so close they could see the whites of the sailors' eyes before the explosions consumed them. They had seen victory, but also humanity, on both sides of the guns. Major Larner continued to fly missions for the rest of the Pacific campaign. Though his name never reached the fame of generals or admirals, among pilots it became legend. When new recruits arrived, instructors would tell them, "If you want to know how to win a war, study Larner at Bismarck Sea." By 1945, the skip bombing technique had become standard doctrine in the Pacific theater. It was used in countless attacks, from New Guinea to the Philippines, crippling Japanese naval strength. The innovation that was once forbidden became the very foundation of low-level bombing strategy. Years later, historians would look back at that March morning and recognize it for what it was, a turning point. The courage of a few men flying barely above the sea changed the direction of the Pacific War. The Bismarck Sea was not just a battle, won. It was proof that bravery, creativity, and sheer willpower could defy even the strongest enemy. In the twilight of his life, Edward Larner rarely spoke about the war, but when asked once what he remembered most, he simply said, "It wasn't the fire or the fear. It was the moment the bomb hit, and I knew, just knew, that we had done something no one thought possible." The waves still carry the echoes of that moment. Somewhere beneath the dark waters of the Bismarck Sea lie the remains of ships and men. Silent witnesses to the day one pilot changed the fate of a war with a single, forbidden idea.